Hello everybody, this is the Vikstrand. So today we're going to talk about Andrei Tarkovsky. He's probably the most famous Russian filmmaker that there is, and the guy when it comes to Russian science fiction. Stalker is probably the most famous movie that he has ever done, but his most critically acclaimed work has got to be the 1972 movie Solaris, to the point where it actually got a big budget Hollywood remake in 2002, directed by Steven Soderbergh, starring George Clooney. I'm going to talk a little bit about that when we get to that. The thing is that this movie will leave you with some impact, and I will agree upon that this movie, to a certain, audience, is the perfect thinking man's science fiction. But to some others, it might not be. But where do I stand with this thing? That's what we're gonna find out today. This is my review of the original Solaris. So for decades, we have this space station that has been circling around the mysterious planet of Solaris, and nobody can quite figure out how Solaris works. And the last time they sent some kind of a manned probe down towards the watery surface of Solaris, only one man came back, Burton, who comes back with weird tales and observations that he has done that nobody believes in. And the station itself is just a shadow of its former self, almost completely abandoned. So they send this psychologist, Chris Kelvin, to the station to try to figure out what is going on here. He arrives there and he realizes after a short while that the planet itself is almost sort of playing mind games with you and showing you, stuff that really isn't there. His wife that has been dead for 10 years, she re-emerges, and he doesn't quite know what to believe when it comes to this. What is this? What's happening on this station? And what is Solaris exactly? That is sort of kind of what this movie is about. So, if you're looking at this story just on paper, just a synopsis of the whole thing, it reads like one of those most awesome space adventures that Christopher Nolan would have made. And I would bet you that Christopher Nolan has seen this movie a number of times and thought to himself, man, I wish I could do something as awesome as this is. Unfortunately, this movie is hampered severely by a couple of things. Mostly that this movie is 167 minutes long. 167 minutes long. I think this movie could have used a lot of trimming. You could have basically removed, an hour from this one, and you would have just gotten the nitty-gritty of the whole thing, because there is a very small cast, and the runtime just feels very, very excessive. Not quite as excessive as, Gene Diddleman. You needed like, 20 minutes or something like that of that shit. But I've already reviewed that movie at one point, so that's a story for another time. Now, I like some of the things that they did in this movie when it comes to how, they shot the whole thing, the long panning shots, and when sometimes it feels like the camera is almost, surrounding him and trying to trap him. That's great. The idea of, how this works, and the whether or not a thing is real or not, and, the character arc that Chris Kelvin is on, that is very interesting. Unfortunately, there's a lot of clunky things happening, and a lot of the dialogue isn't very good, and, and because this movie is so long and moving such an incredibly slow pace, you're getting a bit impatient. And it is so difficult, to try to get around this thing, because, we have so many sequences that seem to go on forever, and because we haven't been told what the setup is, we are trying to find out for ourselves what is happening, and it takes so long for us to realize, oh, they're talking about that. There is some kind of a, fine middle of not telling the audience anything and telling the audience too much. This was telling the audience nothing and hoping that they'll figure this thing out. You have 167 minutes to tell us, but you kind of didn't do that. Now, visually, this movie isn't that impressive either, but on the other hand, they had a very, very limited budget on this one. And considering this is the early 1970s in Soviet Union, it's not exactly the pinnacle of artistic freedom, so I cannot falter Tarkovsky for having to work under those conditions. But I think that the story is so strong and it's so unpredictable, and you're constantly trying to figure out what the hell is gonna happen next time. And because this movie doesn't quite work as your traditional Hollywood space adventure, it is a little bit different. This is a thinking man's science fiction movie. Unfortunately, it is a little bit too much of, pretentious, weird, wacky stuff that is going on here that doesn't quite give you the payoff you want to. Even though I will say this, that the ending of the movie insinuate that, oh my, it is that kind of a mind-bending thing that I absolutely live for. And if it could have been set up a little bit differently, it could have played off like something out of, as I said, a Nolan movie or anything like that. So I think that this movie is a kind of good movie, even though it is very ineffectively told and it's a little bit clunky and a little bit stilted and some stuff really, really doesn't work. But the things that do work, they do work. And in my opinion, and this might just be my opinion, is that this movie is far, far, far superior to the very, very overrated Stalker, which I think is the second most boring movie I have ever seen in my entire life. Gene Diddleman is of course the most boring movie that has ever been made in the history of ever, but of course that is a story for another time. And I also think that if you have seen, 2001: A Space Odyssey, this feels like they're trying to make a Soviet version of 2001: A Space Odyssey, essentially. But the story is fascinating, the story is interesting, and you're constantly trying to figure out where this thing is going. And it is a much, much better movie than the professionally made but kind of bland remake that Steven Soderbergh made with George Clooney, that just sort of is there and just feels like an Americanized version of the whole thing without, really adding anything new to the experience, even though it is a slightly shorter movie. At least we have that to thank good old Steven for. So would I recommend this movie? Yeah, kind of, because it is an experience and it is a unique movie, and the premise is such a awesome thing that you can sometimes forgive this movie for, being a little bit clumsy, a little bit ineffectively told. And did we really need, all of those very, very long shots of, people just walking or riding or, going in this traffic jam thing that seems to go on for minutes upon minutes upon minutes, and it doesn't add anything to the story. It just feels like, they're padding the runtime. But Solaris is a movie that will stay with you because it is a movie that wants to tell you something. It is a movie that has a story to tell, even though it could have been told more efficiently. Is Solaris the greatest Soviet science fiction movie that I've ever seen? Yes. And I do understand why critics would say that this is a masterpiece and it is the pinnacle of Soviet cinema, but I think that it's a little bit overrated, and I think that it is, as I said, a little bit clumsy made. I give Solaris 58 points. I like this movie, I like the characters, but I had a tough time getting into the whole thing because everything was so vague, and the very, very strong story and the very, very strong synopsis isn't effectively told, and it was difficult to really follow it. But it is a science fiction movie that is unlike anything you've ever seen, but it is also a movie that drags and drags and drags. But once you get to the space station, the tempo picks up a little bit, and the movie certainly has its own atmosphere and its own style. And for certain kinds of people, they will love this movie, but the majority will just say this is boring and it is, impossible to follow what's going on here. So have you seen Solaris? What do you think about it? comment below and I'll see you next time for well so-and-so reviewing, well, such and such. Thank you for watching. Thank you very much.